Well, the hospice doctors are in a support role to our teams that go out to the homes, nursing homes, or wherever the patient lives. We're overseeing the medical part of their care. Sometimes we may actually make a visit, a home visit, but more often than not, we're supporting the team by being available 24/7 to give orders or write prescriptions for comfort medications that may be required, to coordinate the care with the community physicians if they're involved, and to oversee the medical care plan, including in the team meetings that are held every 2 weeks to discuss every patient's care plan. We're also responsible for making sure that not only patients have their needs met, but also that they remain eligible for hospice care. For example, most of our patients are using Medicare to pay for their hospice care, so one of our roles would be to make sure that they are eligible to use Medicare for hospice.
Okay. What would you like new volunteers to know about hospice doctors?
Well, hospice doctors are here for a reason. There are lots of different ways to be a doctor. We choose to do this hospice work because it's something special to us. I think we've learned that patients at the end of life, patients who are no longer curable with medical care, still need great medical care, and they need a lot more than that. They need more than just medications and a medical care plan. They need every kind of support for themselves and their family, whether it be emotional, spiritual, practical help. But we doctors realize that they still need attentive medical care. So what we're going to tend to focus on in terms of the medical aspects of the case are those things that will help them to feel better and to feel better soon, so they can have the very best quality of life possible in whatever time they have remaining. This is something we're all passionate about, and that's why we chose this profession, to be a hospice specialist.
Very good. Why did you become a hospice doctor? I know this, but I want you to tell me that.
Well, in my case, I began as a small-town primary care internal medicine doctor, and I took care of lots of patients with chronic medical problems, and many of them went on to have a terminal illness and to die under my care. And what I found is that there was something about caring for those patients that spoke especially to me, that when I was helping my patients that I couldn't cure anymore, when I was working with a team of people that would try to improve their quality of life and support them the best they can, that somehow I felt like more of a doctor than I did when I was, giving blood pressure medicines out or doing a well person checkup. And so it was really working with patients that drew me toward hospice. I could tell that when patients got to that point in their illness where our medical treatment was no longer going to prolong their life, that a lot of times they were getting a lot of things done to them that were not helpful anymore and was actually making them sicker. And to be able to sit down with a patient, be honest with them about their illness and what they can expect, to explore their goals, to find out what they really want, and then to make sure that's what they get, would allow us sometimes to stop some treatments that not only weren't helping, but were actually making them feel worse. And then to focus on getting them comfortable and feeling the best they can, and then bringing in the whole team to support them and their family so that they could have the very best quality of life they could. I found that to be something we could always do. So we can't always cure somebody, but we can always comfort them and support them having the best possible quality of life. So basically, I just felt like I was the best doctor I could be when I was caring for those patients, particularly when I discovered that there's other people, not just doctors, but nurses and home health aides and social workers and chaplains and even volunteers of all things that can go in along with the doctor and nurse and help these folks. Then that's where I needed to be. So it just really called me.
Tell me a Dr. Joe story.
Well, a story I like to share with people I think might be helpful for hospice volunteers too is uh, this may have been one of those moments when I realized that my professional role, being a doctor, was not necessarily more important than just trying to be a good person. And the story is I was caring years ago for a man with cancer who was near the end of his life. He had come into our inpatient care center to get his pain managed. And when he had come in, I had thought if we got his medicines adjusted, he would feel and do better, and then he would have weeks or months of life ahead of him. And so I had certainly thought I would just adjust his meds and he would go home in better shape. But during the course of his time in the inpatient care center, we could see that he was getting sicker and weaker every day. And I felt like it was then my job to help him understand what that might mean. So I went into his room. I was feeling very somber. I sat at the head of his bed. At the foot of his bed was his sister, who was his closest family. And I sat down with this man and began to try to tell him that he seemed to be getting sicker and his time might be short. This was a very beloved man in the community, actually a hairdresser. And I leaning down and I'm talking to him, and I began in my quietest voice, well, how do you think you're doing? And he said, not as well. And I said, yes. And, I had really hoped you would be eating more and feeling stronger and able to do more by now. And he said, yes. And I leaned over further and I said, you know, you might not have as much time as I thought that you were going to have. And I'm practically fighting back tears, so is his sister, and I'm leaning forward, and suddenly this fellow just reaches up with both hands, grabs my head, and gives me one of these. Vigorous rub. I'm completely dazed. I stop for a second. His sister breaks out laughing. He breaks out laughing, and about a second later, I break out laughing. And I gather myself, and I look him in the eye, and he says to me, I know. It's okay. So we were able to get him home a few days later, and he lived a couple of weeks, and he died comfortably at home. Because I thought he'd taught me a lesson, I went to his funeral, and or his visitation, and as I walked in, I could see his sister and family members in the back of the room, and they called me over, and she began introducing me to everybody as the doctor I told you about, that one where he rubbed his head for good luck. And so they all wanted to do this as a memorial to him, so I had to stand there, and they all lined up, and one by one they walked up to me and rubbed my head. We all did this in honor of this man. The lesson he taught me was that while I was so focused on my role as a doctor trying to give him the bad news, what he really wanted and needed that moment was for me just to be myself. And I thought that was an incredibly valuable lesson. One of the things I love about our volunteers is that that's the gift they bring. They bring the gift of their own humanity, of being themselves. More than anybody else on the hospice team, the volunteer is on an equal footing with the patient. They're not there in a professional role. They're not the doctor giving the doctor's orders or the nurse who's assessing their medical condition. They're a fellow human being there to support them, and that is so powerful.
Wow, I've heard that story, and it's still just... what else would you like new volunteers to know?
Well, I'd like our hospice volunteers to know that regardless of what kind of work you do for this organization, you are making a huge difference. We have volunteers, of course, who work directly with patients and families, whether it be during the illness or during the grief work that occurs afterwards, and that is incredibly special work. But everything volunteers do is a tremendous help to us. Volunteers who help us write thank you notes, volunteers who help us make phone calls, volunteers who help us file away important papers, volunteers that serve on our boards, volunteers that serve on our committees, volunteers that help us put on events and raise money so we can provide care that's not covered by Medicare, and care then for children who who we're taking care of charitably, or to provide more bereavement care. Whatever our volunteers do, it's special, and it makes a big difference here. We're a lot more than a medical care entity. We're not just a health care provider, because we focus on whole people, on their family, on quality of life. You're never going to see enough coming from Medicare to cover that. And we're never going to be able to hire enough professionals to get the job done. We're always going to need those folks in the community who just care and just want to give a little bit of themselves for the sake of our patients and families. And I just thank you for being one of those people.
Wow. Is there anything else that you would like people to know?
Well, I think our hospice volunteers really have a special position, and sometimes I wish that I could volunteer, although I think my family appreciates that I get a paycheck sometimes. But I can tell you I've known professionals, doctors, who went on to become patient care volunteers here at hospice. And what they've been able to tell me is that the sharing that goes on between a patient and a volunteer is something that a doctor and patient would never, ever see. So when doctors become volunteers, they usually don't tell the patient that they're doctors, because that would wreck it. When they're just a fellow human being who cares, when there isn't this doctor-patient thing going on where somehow the doctor is supposed to be the powerful one and the patient is supposed to do what they say, what they learn from patients and what the patients can share is something totally different. So it's been real eye-opening for me to talk to some retired physicians that have become volunteers and have them tell me that they never would have experienced in their whole medical career the kinds of things they experience as a volunteer. So again, you're embarking on something very, very special.